and start. I know the service went a little long, and I don't know where Clover is. I thought she was supposed to introduce me. But anyway, I'm Tim Beal. I'm married to, there she is. Married to Clover. Yeah, and Clover, are you staying or are you doing something? Oh, okay. All right. And I'm a professor of religious studies out at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio, which is where I'm going to go this afternoon, not long after this, if my flight doesn't get canceled. So we'll see. But we are continuing with this. The series is called The Story of the Good Book, the Past, Present, and Future of Scripture. And I just want to be clear that this is not a comprehensive story. This is some selections from that larger story. I like this piece of artwork here. It is a sort of, sometimes they call it a deconstructed book, but it's book art where people take, books and they make other kinds of things out of them. And I just think that's an interesting image to play with here as we are sort of, in the twilight years of the print book, if you will. We've been in that, what we sometimes call the bibliographic regime, the era of the print book for more than 500 years, but it's interesting to think about the Bible after the book and the Bible before the book, and so that's really in large part what this series is about, is sort of thinking about past, present, and future, and breaking open our ideas about the Bible that are bound very strongly to print book culture, the ways we think about Scripture being so tied to the ways we think about books and print books. And in fact, you hear, the Bible is the book of books. And if you think about what's the sort of iconic image of the print book, it's probably Gutenberg's Bible. We were just talking about that, or another print Bible. So we want to think about the Bible before the book. We want to think about the Bible during the era of print, and we want to think about the Bible after the book as well. So that's the kind of space we're going to be in. And this is a Prezi, so we'll zoom around a little bit in here. Just a little bit about the kind of general orientation of what we're doing in this series. We're really interested here in what scholars like myself would call the cultural history of Bible. So cultural history, the short way to describe cultural history is that cultural history is about the history of meaning. That is to say, it's the history of how people in different cultural contexts make meaning and understand things. And so in this case, if we're talking about cultural history of Bible, then we're exploring how the Bible and the biblical take on different forms and different meanings in different cultural contexts. Our data for doing that kind of work, for trying to understand different cultural contexts for Bible and different ways Bible is understood and circulates in different cultural contexts, our data is going to be biblical culture. It's going to be biblical images, biblical words, biblical things like books, scrolls, so forth, biblical practices like ways of reading, ways of interpreting, ways of using those biblical things in worship contexts and other contexts. And we analyze all of this data as kind of what we call symptoms of culture. These are signs that help us sort of diagnose the syndrome, which is a collection of symptoms that is culture in a particular cultural context, to understand what Bible means and how it operates in particular cultural contexts. So in this series, the kinds of things we're mostly looking at here are the different media technologies of scriptures. So we talked about scrolls and codices last week. We'll review that. We're going to be talking about print book culture this time, and eventually we'll be thinking about other kinds of media, digital networked media as well. So in this series, taking a cultural history perspective, this story of the book that goes from scroll to codex to book to digital media is not simply about the Bible in different media, it's about the Bible as different media. I want you to sort of reflect and think about that. The Bible doesn't come to us sort of carried in a particular media or mediated in a particular media. Bible is inseparable from the media technologies in which we encounter it. So it's not Bible in media, but Bible as media. What the Bible is, that is to say what it means, how it functions, how we interact with it, is inseparable from the media in which we know it. I just said that. There is no word that transcends the material forms and cultural contexts in, with, and under which we know it. So what I hope for this larger series as a big takeaway for you all is that if there is one constant in this story of Bible, that constant is change. In fact, there is no such thing as the Bible. The Bible today is not a thing, as we'll see more and more clearly, but rather a kind of cultural idea. Sometimes I talk about the cultural icon of the Bible. It's a cultural idea constituted by a network of biblical words, images, things, beliefs, and practices. This has always been true and always will be true. Bible, Scripture means and is different things in different contexts. And we'll talk a little more about that next week too with the Give Me That Old Time religion, focusing on the rise of fundamentalism, which really, hangs on to a certain cultural, iconic idea of the Bible, claiming that it goes all the way back to Paul and Silas. It was good for Paul and Silas. It's good enough for me, right? And so we'll be thinking a lot about that as we go through. And by the way, if you're interested in this kind of thing, I've written a couple books related to it. One is called The Rise and Fall of the Bible, The Unexpected History of an Accidental Book. Not the accidental history of an unexpected book, but that works too. And that really starts by looking at the Bible business today, the evangelical Bible publishing business. Touch it, I swear. There it is. Okay. And then looks back at that story like, I sort of begin with, it's the end of the word as we know it, the end of the word as we know it. That is cultural understanding of the Bible, and the Bible as we have known it is really sort of falling apart in some ways. We're in the twilight of a certain sort of iconic idea of the Bible that's been around for a while, but not as long as we might think. It's being brought about, this end, by a couple revolutions in the history of the Bible, the Gutenberg, the end of print culture and the rise of digital network culture. We had this problem last week too. Sorry for anybody who's online, you're going to be hearing some of this. And then the rise of evangelical capitalism, really. And then from there, after declaring the end, I say, well, what's the larger story? How did we get here, and where can we go from here? And that's where we sort of discover that if there's one constant in the history of Scripture, it is change. And then where can we go from here? And so that's sort of the shape in some ways of what I'd like to talk with you today about as well. Another book I did called The Book of Revelation, a Biography, really tries to do that specifically with the biblical text and the constellation of other things and ideas and images and so forth around Revelation, and focus on that and do a kind of cultural history of Revelation. So those would be some things if you want to read more. So back out to our deconstructed book, and just to review from last week, Dr. Christy Cobb was with us, did a brilliant job and her topic was, what would Jesus read? From the early Jesus movement to the imperial Roman Church. So she was looking at, the early scriptural cultures and practices around the time of Jesus, and a little before and a little after, and then going into early Christianity and all the way up to, the imperial Roman Christian Church in the 4th century. She showed us this amazing, recently discovered text called Papyrus Oxyrhynchus 5575, which is a very small scrap of papyrus. You can see it's only about 2.5 centimeters wide. That appears to be a fragment from a piece of papyrus that included several quotations from Jesus that we know from different places in other Gospels, in Matthew and Luke, and in also the Gospel of Thomas, which is an early gospel that did not make it into the New Testament canon. It's a collection of sayings of Jesus. So very, very fascinating in all kinds of ways, because one, it tells us that they didn't, and we knew this already, but this is more strong evidence for this, that the early Jesus movement, early followers of Jesus in these communities didn't simply read whole gospels in whole scrolls. They were practicing this kind of snippet sort of collecting of quotes that might seem to be related to one another in some way. Sometimes they're called testimonia. And, you might pull bits and pieces from those and put them together onto a single sheet or onto a smaller scroll or something like that. And so this starts to open up our imaginations to thinking about how these scriptures were circulating. It wasn't like a New Testament or even a box full of scrolls that added up to our modern day New Testament of 27 texts, right? It was various collections circulating in various ways, copies of copies of copies, lots of variance among those different copies, lots of diversity. Some texts that are not now in our canon that were very important for early communities, other texts that are now in our canon that were excluded by some of those communities. So a very loose network of communities working with a very loose collection of scriptures that were open to change and revision and recombination. And then she showed us some examples of the invention of the big codex. So codices, that's plural for codex, which is basically a book, but a handwritten, hand-bound book before print culture. Codices were circulating in Christianity fairly early, not really, really early, but definitely, I think, early 200s and maybe a little before then, to collect, for example, letters of Paul, or to include something like the book of Isaiah or something longer like that. But for the most part, that technology of the codex had not advanced far enough to be something like this. This is Codex Sinaiticus, which is from the late 4th or maybe early 5th century, after the establishment of Christianity as the official imperial religion of the Roman Empire. You could get a big fat codex like this that could actually hold all of the texts of a Christian canon of an Old Testament and a New Testament, right? So you didn't even have a media technology that could possibly hold together in a single volume until the 4th century. And that's significant. I'll talk more about that in a minute. A couple close-ups of Codex Sinaiticus that I think are really fascinating. You might be looking at them and going, why? But Dr. Cobb mentioned that that this codex and many other codices were made not from papyrus, which is a way of making paper using the papyrus plant, but from parchment, which is made from animal skins, a very complex way that they have to prepare these skins. And these are traces of the animal lives that were part of Codex Sinaiticus. And so if you look on the left, you can see some little dark lines. Those are veins. Those are the traces of veins on the skin of the parchment there. And that, can you guess what that is? It's like a spinal cord and ribs, right? From the parchment there. Just to remind us of the material, in this case, animal materiality of books and scriptures and so forth. A few things just to remind us of related to Dr. Cobb's talk that I think are worth us keeping in mind. One, just to remember about what kinds of social practices were operating around these different scriptures. These people didn't have these in their homes, right? They were hard to make, they were complicated. Most people probably were not able to read to themselves. The way most people read scripture was in community, hearing it read aloud, and in most cases that would have been canted, that is to say, sung in a kind of melodic, rhythmic way. But this would have been a public, social context of reading. People did not read silently to themselves. There's a story about one of the early church fathers and one of this person's followers sees him reading and moving his lips but not making any sounds, and he's like, doesn't even know what it is. He's never seen it before, but reading silently comes along later. So that's important to remember, the kind of social practices around these, the ways these were read. And just to think even about the big differences between reading a scroll and reading a codex, right? So a scroll might be 40 feet long, might be anywhere from 12 to 40 feet long, depending on how big of a text is going into it. And it's got those columns like this. And so just imagine, for example, you're reading and you're reading here and you're thinking, oh, there's something like that, in another scroll or at the end of this text. You're not going to, just a minute, just roll for the next 15 minutes until you find it, right? It's a different kind of material experience with the text. You read where you land, in a way. And that story where Jesus, gets up in his hometown synagogue and reads from Isaiah, is it 4? I can't remember suddenly, but no, that's Luke 4. I can't remember where in Isaiah he read. But he found the place where it said. That probably doesn't mean he rolled back and forth and found the text. He probably found it in the near vicinity of where the scroll was already open to, right? And he would have canted it. He would have sung that text in a melodic, rhythmic way. So when he says it's fulfilled in your hearing, can we even imagine what that would have been like? It's kind of gives me goosebumps to think about, in your hearing, what that would mean. But so that's a scroll reading practice, right? And they would have been kept in some kind of box or basket or something like that. Different communities would have different scrolls, obviously, and different smaller pieces of text as well. And now compare that with a codex, with a book, with a big book. One of the things that you can do very easily with a big book is move back and forth between different passages. So cross-referencing and connecting up different passages becomes possible in a completely different way than it had been in a scroll culture, right? And that's just one of the many ways in which we can think about the differences between scroll and codex. And then the other thing to keep in mind, and I think Christy was saying the same thing, it's not a coincidence that the big fat codex comes about, reaches the point where it can be a big codex like that in the late 4th century, which is also when Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, is becoming established and is becoming identified with the Roman Empire. Rome is now Christian since Constantine, right? And there is an effort then to organize the church, to network it, to create hierarchies, to establish orthodox doctrine, and all of that, and to establish a closed canon or a more or less closed canon, a canon of Scripture that is sort of fixed and official. Because you've gone from a Jesus movement that is sort of loosely networked and not very hierarchical, not as hierarchical anyway, to it being identified with the Roman Empire and getting sort of structured into that imperial context. The Codex helped make that happen, and we could even suggest maybe that it was essential. It was the essential media technology for the establishment of the canon, for the establishment of Orthodox Christian doctrine, and for the establishment of the Roman imperial church. So that was part one. Today, how are we doing? Pretty good. We're going to move on to part two, Sola Scriptura, which is a rallying cry, I guess you could say, for the Reformation, meaning Scripture only is what that means. Don't need anything but Scripture, in other words, was the sort of rallying cry for the Protestant Reformation, and the invention of the print book. And I want you to remember what I just said about it's not a coincidence that the big codex comes along at the same time as the establishment of the Roman Catholic Church and Christianity as state religion, because we have a non-coincidental correlation here between the print book and the Protestant Reformation as well. So recall again that in the Codex culture, which really goes all the way from the 4th century to the 15th century, you had handwritten manuscripts, hand-bound, handwritten manuscripts. These are copies of copies of copies of copies. They include images and texts. Some beautiful, illuminated manuscripts is what they're sometimes called, with incredible art as well. These were often private, contracted by a wealthy person to have made for themselves. They might include all of the Latin Vulgate scriptures, or they might have included right? So then comes the Gutenberg Revolution, as we like to call it, 1450 roughly, when Johannes Gutenberg builds his first printing press. Movable type had already been around for some time. You know what movable type is? Little pieces of metal type that are all the same height, that have raised letters and numbers of different sizes, and you can move them around and rearrange them to create different words, right? And sentences and paragraphs and pages. So movable type was already there, but there were different ways of inking that and then pressing paper onto it to get a text. What's important is the combination of movable type with the printing press, and the ability then, to lay out movable type into chases and then run multiple pages through the same set of movable type, and then fold those and cut those and end up with a print book. So this is what we have as this revolution in the mid 15th century. And you might expect, right, that finally, given the printing press and what it can do, that the Bible will finally be standardized. The canon finally be closed. Because why? Because you can set it once and you could make 100 bazillion copies of the same exact thing, and they're all going to be the same. No worries about copying different versions. That you can standardize it, and then you can just print it and print it and print it forever, and it's always going to be the same, right? You'd think that would be what the printing press might have led to. Typeset, by the way, locked in. I know that phrase is used in a lot of contexts, but one of the early uses of that phrase was after you set the type, you lay all the type out, on the page the way you want it. and then the chase is the frame around that, and you use these little, I do letterpress stuff, you use these little key-driven things that lock that type in and hold it in place. So locked in means can't change it anymore, right? It'd be a big pain in the ass to try to unlock it, loosen it all up, take your tweezers and pull some letters out and put in some other ones and change the spacing. Once it's locked in, it's locked in. You can't change it anymore. So locked in, typeset, standardized, closed, right? You'd think so. Wrong. The dawning of print book culture led not to a standardization of the Bible. On the contrary, it led to an exponentially greater proliferation of Bibles in all their variety. And those are just a few examples of many, many, many examples from the first couple centuries or so of print book culture and after. There's a great catalog that has cataloged and described every Bible that could be found in English from the beginning of print to 1800. And by 1800, there were over 2,000 different Bibles in English alone that had been published, and they represent a wildly diverse array of forms. Like here are some examples. You've got tiny little thumb-sized Bibles, and you've got all kinds of different versions of this text. So just a proliferation of diversity and difference is what the print revolution actually led to when it comes to the history of Bible. So I want to just spend a little time. Reformation Sunday will look, sorry, I get loud and then it comes back on and I scare you. Sorry about that. Some early examples of print Bibles from those early years of the Reformation. So first is, and if people can't hear, if they're online, at least you've got pictures that pretty much are showing what I'm also saying. So Erasmus, very, very important biblical scholar and theologian from the early 16th century and late 15th century. Erasmus published something called the Novum Instrumentum in 1516. The Novum Instrumentum, he didn't call it Novum Testamentum for a reason, because that might have seemed threatening to the Roman Catholic Church. He wanted to suggest that this was an instrument, a tool that people could use, scholars could use especially, in order to explore the New Testament and its Greek text. You know that the New Testament all comes to us in Greek, probably was all written in Greek, as Christy was talking about last week. And then the Latin Vulgate translation, it was a Latin translation of it that became the kind of standard normative canonical scripture for the Roman Catholic Church. What Erasmus did in the Novum Testamentum, one, was produce this incredibly beautiful book. I mean, look at it. I love that cover page, and that was often how they would do it. But beautiful type design here. These early scholars, they were collaborators. They were not sitting by themselves, doing their work all by themselves. They had to work with typesetters. They had to work with people doing a page layout. They had to be collaborating with them and thinking about how the language and the text relates to the type design and the layout on the page and all of those things at the same time. We've gotten away from that, but just to get ahead of ourselves a little bit, I think post-book culture, we're heading into a time again where there's going to need to be more collaborative work in ways that are creative and interdisciplinary, like what we have with Erasmus. So a beautiful book. What it provided was an interlinear text in which the left column was the Greek text that most scholars used as a basis for the New Testament back then. They didn't have as much manuscript evidence as we do now. We have lots of different versions, but it was the Greek text on the left side, and then what's on the right is not the Vulgate translation, it's his translation. It's Erasmus's translation. And oftentimes Erasmus's translation is pretty significantly different from the Vulgate translation. So he's not, and he says, this is just an instrument, these are just like notes to think about, the Greek and to kind of help you read the Greek. But in fact, it's implicitly a critique of the Vulgate translation, insofar as he's providing a different translation that differs from the Vulgate that is based on the Greek, right? So that's one wonderful example. There's a copy of this in our special collections library at Case Western Reserve, and that's my thumb there where I was taking some pictures of it, but it's really a beautiful text. So this is Luther's Bible, Reformation Sunday. Luther really took advantage of the invention of the print book and print book culture to promote his Reformation and his theology and his understanding of the Bible and his translations of the Bible. What he did first in 1522 was publish what was called the September Testament, because it was published in September of 1522, and it was a New Testament only. This was the first time the New Testament was translated into a vernacular language, into German. He used the Saxon dialect, and because Luther's Bible became so popular, essentially the Saxon dialect became the standard normative form of German for all of Germany. It had that much of a social impact, social influence. It was hugely popular. Really, I would say, and this is back to what I was saying about how the Codex and the Holy Roman Empire are inseparable, I would say that the print book and the Protestant Reformation are equally inseparable. That the Protestant Reformation was as much a media revolution as it was a theological or ecclesiological revolution. Tied also to this idea of sola scriptura, scripture alone, this idea that, this ideal really, that everyone should have their hands on the Bible, that it isn't controlled by authorities and the priesthood, but that everyone should have access to it. Literacy really boomed as a result of that as well, as a result of Bible reading. But this democratization of biblical interpretation that is part of the Protestant Reformation. So, but, we were talking about the history of, the only constant in the history of Scripture is change. And another dimension of that change I want to talk with you a little bit now about. I mentioned already this proliferation of different versions of Bible that the print technology made possible. This is a close-up of the table of contents in Luther's September Testament. I got to look at one of these in Emory University's Pitts Theological Library. They have an incredible Reformation collection, special collections, and this is one of those, one of that September Testament that they actually have a physical copy of. But look at this table of contents, right? So there's 27 books here. That's how many there are in the New Testament now, in our canon. But you'll notice a couple things. One, it's hard to see, I'm sorry. But one is that 23 of them are numbered, 1 to 23. And up at the top, you've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. And then into, and the Acts of the Apostles, and then into the letters. But you only get to 23. It stops at the third letter of John there. And then there's a gap. And then there's 4 more. You want to guess which ones they are? Well, it's kind of hard in this context. But it's the Epistle to the Hebrews. It's the Epistle of James, where James says, how is it? It's the opposite of justified by grace. It's basically justified by works. And then the Epistle of Judas, and finally the Revelation of John. Those are the four texts that are listed without numbers and with a kind of gap, right? They're not really on the same level as these other 23, the way they're laid out in this table of contents. And in fact, when you go and you look at what Luther says about them in his little prefatory remarks in each, because he provides introductory remarks to each of these books in his September Testament, he's not very flattering about them. He thinks they're, much as he thought about the book of Esther and some of the apocryphal texts, he thinks they're too Jewish, that they Judaize, to use that expression from the book of Galatians, which is, that's Paul's letter to the Galatians, where he's criticizing certain early Christian communities for wanting to be observant and wanting to, get circumcised and things like that. Luther's big on grace over law, right? And so these seem to have a little too much of an emphasis on law, maybe, or on works over grace. They don't quite fit his theology as well. And so he kind of separates them out. They're still there, part of the New Testament, but they're not quite on the same level as the other ones. And in his preface to the book of Revelation, he basically says he wished it weren't in the Bible, and that people can find much clearer expressions of the gospel in other places in the New Testament. He basically says there are plenty of other good places to read and understand the gospel, and I recommend that you do that. And is quite critical of it. Feels like it's almost unreadable, right? So that's Luther's view. And it suggests that in some ways the canon still was open to some degree, negotiable to some degree. These are not on equal standing with the other New Testament texts, and same with Esther in the Hebrew Scriptures, and same with the Apocrypha, the Jewish Apocrypha as well. So still kind of subject to change. What's, I think, kind of funny is that we can talk about Luther's Bible versus Cranach's Bible, because Lucas Cranach was an artist who did these illustrations for the September Testament, and they showed up in later Luther Bibles as well. And he did them only for the book of Revelation. And so I forget how many there are, 22, 24 illustrations in the book of Revelation. They are really bizarre. As you can kind of see, like if you look at that well there, there's this, that's the locusts with with faces like humans. It's kind of this bizarro, looks like something drawn today maybe even. And that's the image of the risen Christ with a sword coming out of its mouth and stars in its hands, and kind of just a wildly busy and extravagant sort of visualization of these texts that some would argue, that I would argue, are actually kind of unvisualizable. They are descriptions, writings of images that cannot be depicted. You can describe things that you cannot depict, right? And that's part of what's happening in the book of Revelation. But what's interesting is that, so Luther kind of wished it wasn't even in the Bible and hoped people would ignore it, but Cranach's illustrations made it maybe one of the most popular parts of Luther's Bibles. And when I was there at Emory looking at some early Luther Bibles, you could see that those last pages, if you hold the book up this way, so you're looking at the pages, the dirt made the book of Revelation more popular than less. So that's Luther, and a little bit about the September Testament and his Bible. And then finally, just not sure. But the New Testament came out in 1514, and then the whole thing came out in 1520. It's called the Complutensian Polyglot Bible. And there were lots of polyglot Bibles, and polyglot Bible means a many-languaged Bible. And so what they were doing with these polyglot Bibles was they were finding all of the different versions of Scripture that they could possibly find and putting them all into the same book so that a scholar or someone else might be able to compare the different versions themselves and put them all together. Again, kind of empowering scholarship, empowering different readings. But this was done by a collaborative team of scholars, type designers, and printers. In Complutum, Spain, there's a modern-day name for that. That's the name of the Roman village. But this is the Old Testament here, and on each page of this you can see, and this is the first 4 volumes are in the Old Testament, you can see 7 different columns, and they are in 4 different languages using 5 different fonts. So just think about all of the work around designing what a page should look like, where you put these, how you keep them sort of, organized and in parallel to one another, the sizes of the type that you'd have to use in order to keep everything going along, because some of these texts have a lot higher word count than other texts do as they're going along, and just all of the brilliant work that had to be done to create this. Truly a collaborative, artistic, scholarly, material sort of project. You can find reprints of this, and you can go online and explore some of these early Bibles as well. There are other polyglot Bibles. Another very famous one is the London Polyglot. And many times the lead scholars on these teams, especially with the London Polyglot, they were in the middle of big theological, biblical arguments, and part of what they were trying to do in publishing their own Bibles was to promote their own sort of theology and their own understanding of the Bible and their own reading of it. So politics of difference and contention and argument were everywhere. And I think that's really the big gist I want to for us to keep in mind is the big takeaway again is just that with these new media technology, we see always more change, more difference, oftentimes more proliferation of difference, and all of these things, I think, sort of fly in the face of our kind of iconic idea of what the Bible is. So just to sort of sum up, recall from last week that the invention of the Codex, check the time. The invention of the Codex was inseparable from the establishment of the canon, the establishment of Christian orthodoxy, and the establishment of the Imperial Roman Catholic Church. Again, as I've already kind of said, I'm asking it rhetorically, were the print revolution and Reformation just coincidental? Of course not. Might argue that the Protestant Reformation couldn't have happened without the print book. Maybe the print book wouldn't have happened the same way without the Protestant Reformation either. Reformation was as much a media revolution as it was a theological revolution, and as much as it was an ecclesiological revolution. Marshall McLuhan famously said, and this is way back in the early 60s, the medium is the message, and even if we don't remember that Marshall McLuhan was the one who first said that, we probably know that dictum. And what Marshall McLuhan meant by that, I think, is a little bit more than sometimes what we maybe mean by that. I think when we hear medium is the message, we think, well, the medium in which we're encountering it is going to change our interpretation of the words or something like that, right? Like if we watch the Bible, we watch the Gospel of Matthew on a TV screen or on film, or listen to it or read it in a text or in some other format, that's going to change how we understand the words, how we interpret the words, what kind of meaning we draw. And that's part of message for Marshall McLuhan, but it's much more radical than that. What Marshall McLuhan means by message above all, he says the most important message of any medium is its social effect. It's how it changes us and the ways we organize ourselves and relate to one another and interact with one another. The social effect is the most powerful and important message of any medium. And that's why Marshall McLuhan can talk about a light bulb as a medium. He's not just talking about books and radio and TV, or if he were alive today, internet and other things like that. He's talking about medium in a much broader sense. And so if you think about a light bulb as a medium and the kind of social effect that a light bulb has, right, in terms of the ways we organize our days, our ability to do things in the dark, the ways we gather around lights, and maybe less gathered around lights instead of around fires or hearths or things like that. The social effect is the most important message of any medium. And so when we think about the print book and the social effect as its message, the Protestant Reformation and all of the changes sociologically that have happened in our world as a result of print, and likewise with the codex, and likewise with the scroll, and so on. So just keep thinking about that as we move through all of this. And next week we are going to talk about the rise of fundamentalism, and we'll talk also about the rise of evangelicalism as well. I think a lot of us sort of think those are the same things, but I'm going to try to argue that they're not, that they're really significantly different, and that evangelicalism emerges out of fundamentalism, but is very different from fundamentalism in a lot of ways. So that's all for now, and I will see you next time where we'll talk about that. I think we have some time for conversation. Thanks.
Hi, is this on? Just talk. Maybe it would be helpful to talk about the canonization of the Bible. We've talked about all these different books that are here, there, and other places. And for some people, it might be just helpful to know, how did we come up with the exact Bible that we have today?
Yeah, and that's back to the problem. I mean, part of what I'd want to qualify as the Bible we have today isn't a thing. It's an idea, and on the ground, in terms of its material realities and what's included and what's not canonically, there's a lot of variation. But and Christy talked a little bit about this last week. It's a very long and complicated story. Some of the big sort of chapters, I guess you could say, when we're talking about early Christianity, the Jesus movement, the first century, really well into the 4th century, you didn't have a canon. You had a lot of scriptures, some of which are now in our canon of scriptures and some of which are not, some of which we don't even have any surviving manuscripts from. We just know about them because early church leaders were writing about them, and even sometimes would quote them into their writing. So we know they existed, but we don't have actual manuscripts from them anymore. So you have that early period where there wasn't anything like a closed canon. All the way into the 3rd and 4th centuries, when you look at one of the early pieces of that story that is worth paying attention to is in 325 Common Era. So this is after Christianity has become the sort of official religion of the Roman Empire under Constantine. Eusebius, who is a very important scholar of the church and bishop, he writes a long ecclesiastical history, and in that he gives a list. It's a complicated list of scriptures, and he categorizes them into three. He puts them into three categories. One is the scriptures that everybody in the New Testament, it's all just New Testament. One is the New Testament texts that everybody agrees are scriptural and authoritative and should be in. And that includes the Gospels, and it includes a lot of what's in the New Testament, but it doesn't include everything that's in our New Testament. Then he has a second list that he describes as a list of texts that some communities use and consider scriptural, and other communities reject and do not consider scriptural. And he has other ones in there, such as Peter, such as the book of Revelation, which is a curious one, and I'm forgetting some of the other examples just off the top of my head. And then he has a third category. He says, these are the ones that almost everybody agrees should be rejected, that they're fakes, that they're written by other people claiming to be the apostles, stuff like that. Revelation is also in that list, along with a number of other things. And so we know that in the early 4th century, this was still contested. There still was nothing like a closed canon. You get to a letter from Athanasius in 367 Common Era, and Athanasius in this Easter letter gives a list of 27 texts that he says are the scriptural, the appropriate scriptural texts that are inspired and should be included, and no others. And that includes the 27 that are in our New Testament now. But the fact that he had to say that and assert that would suggest that there were communities that didn't agree with that same list. When you get to the Vulgate, you again have the examples of the Vulgate that have survived aren't exactly the same as our canon. And then you have this manuscript history where you have still some variety. So what I would say is that there's been a kind of core set of texts that have rarely been questioned, and this is true within Jewish scriptural history as well. You think about the Torah, and then you think about the prophets, and then you think about the writings, and then you think about other rabbinic sources and so forth. It's almost like concentric circles. And you have things like the Gospels and the letters of Paul, that are core to that New Testament canon. But it's just, it's never really been quite closed. And the Bible as we have it, especially if you think, well, is it still just that core canon of, let's say, 27 texts in the New Testament, if you've got all of these notes and commentaries and introductory essays and headings added telling you what the subject of the next verses is, and all of these things that add interpretive layers onto what's there, and of course, so just go from there. So, I think this is part of the work of sorting out sort of the Bible our idea of the Bible as we have it from scripture on the ground and how it circulates. I hope that's helpful. Yes, yes. Although they don't. They have a Bible that includes the Apocrypha in it, which for example, the additions to Esther that are in the Apocrypha wildly change the book of Esther and how you understand it. When you look at Orthodox churches outside of the West, there are different canons again. So probably 6 or 7 different canons of Scripture in Christendom. Protestants don't include the Apocrypha, Catholics do. But you're right. I mean, it's not going to be completely foreign to you. It's not going to include the purpose-driven life or Thich Nhat Hanh. Even though for a lot of us, one or the other might be almost scriptural for us. Probably not both. Yeah.
So you were explaining how the Codex really helped with canonization of Christian scriptures. I was thinking if Christianity is an Abrahamic religion, and as I understood it, the Judea, Judaism had pseudo-canon before that. How does that interplay? Did they have that same sort of kind of revolution with the invention of the Codex, or did it kind of
It's a great question. It's very different, the cultural history of Scripture in Jewish history, Jewish tradition, than it is in Christian history and tradition. Christians seem to have been early adopters of the Codex as a media technology, for one. That's not true in rabbinic Judaism. Scrolls were normative for scriptures, which already, as we've just been discussing, makes you think about a canon in a very different way. And I think it is, most scholars, I would say, when you talk about the history of canonization in Jewish scriptural history, the Torah was probably earliest on accepted as core scripture. Then the prophets, the Nevi'im, which is prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah, but also, the so-called former prophets, Joshua, Judges, 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Samuel. And then the writings later, and so even into the 2nd century, I think, you still have arguments within Judaism about whether Esther and the Song of Songs ought to be, their language is dirty the hands, which means that they would be sacred, that you have to be very careful how you handle them. And probably part of the reason why those two were still questioned then was that neither of them ever mentioned God, and actually don't even mention any religious practices. It's also what Luther didn't like about Esther. Basically a story of Jewish revenge against a pogrom, and there's no God, right, in the story, or nothing explicit anyway. So you can see how that process went along, but then when you get to the kind of formalizing of rabbinic Judaism in the Talmud and those texts, they will say that it's always been this way, it's always been Torahs are only allowed to be on scrolls made of parchment, made in this exact way. That's probably not true. That's probably sort of normativizing earlier history where there might have been more variation. And you also had this Greek translation of Hebrew scriptures, of the Hebrew Bible, that was circulating, and many Jewish people outside of Judea, their lingua franca was Greek, not Hebrew. And so that was a scriptural tradition that was read and circulated among Jewish people. It's probably mostly the basis for the gospel writers as well. And that was the basis for a lot of Latin translations early on. Jerome went and used the Hebrew text in his translations of Hebrew scriptures. And so, that's a little bit more about that. But there are big differences, and part of it has to do with adopting or not adopting the media technology of the codex. When you get to later in Jewish history, in the medieval period and after, you have these amazing codices that are really our best surviving manuscripts of Hebrew scriptures, one called Codex Leningrad, the Leningrad Codex, and the Aleppo Codex are two of the most important ones. And then you have, in print culture, Jewish publishers doing these incredible print book versions of the Talmud that look a lot like that Complutensian polyglot that I was showing you, where you've got, except that it's like the core, the Mishnah text, and then the Gemara commented on the Mishnah by the rabbis, and then the students of the rabbis, and then Rashi's commentary, and then the students of Rashi commenting on each of those earlier layers. And it's just this big, beautiful page of all of these different texts. And again, type design, page layout, all of those kinds of things coming into play. So they certainly adopted it, that media technology for other things. And if you're interested in looking at how Jewish scholars and thinkers and practitioners are doing that in digital culture, we'll talk about it more later, but there's something called Sepharia. You can just look it up, SEFARIA.org or com, I can't remember, or net. And it's an online digital thing that kind of reminds me of those incredible Talmud pages, from that are so famous now.
Thank you.
Oh, wait. Thanks. I was too long-winded in my answers. Sorry about that. We can talk after. Yeah. Thank you.